The Legend of Zelda series is one of my... wait, do I really need to explain Zelda? I mean, we all know how for 30 plus years, Nintendo has been giving us incredible games in the Zelda series, filled with action, platforming, puzzles, and adventure. And with Breath of the Wild, we've never had so much adventure in a Zelda title. And now, after so much waiting, it's finally happening, the release. But how did this game come together over the 4 years since it was first announced? Where did this art style originate from? Why are there spaceships attacking Link in a tracksuit? And what changes were made during development? Because there are quite a few to show you, thanks in part to the help of both Zelda Dungeon and Nintendo Everything, whose websites' links are in the description, and I highly recommend checking them out. So let's not drag out this intro any longer, because on this episode of Beta64, we're going to learn all about the development of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild technically began its development in 2011 while creating the Zelda HD experience for E3 that same year. Do you remember it? It was that cool little tech demo for Wii U that was talked about all the time back then. In fact, Miyamoto even confirmed during E3 2011 that Nintendo was already planning out the first HD Zelda game. But that's all we heard about it until January 23, 2013, during the Wii U Direct presentation. While Aonuma couldn't describe the game in very much detail or show off any visuals, he did discuss the driving theme behind the game's development. The mission of this new game was to rethink the conventions of Zelda. Conventions like having to complete dungeons in a specific order, or that you have to play the game by yourself. The team had decided to set aside these conventions and instead go back to the basics to create a newborn Zelda game. He explained that they had also wanted to implement this with Skyward Sword, but they weren't able to put enough effort into changing the linear structure of the game. And speaking of past Zelda games, after the team behind the Zelda HD experience had shown off their tech demo at E3, the team continued converting past Zelda games into HD in order to find the right art style for this new Zelda game. While converting Wind Waker to higher resolution graphics, they noticed that the change had completely transformed the game, beyond cosmetic differences. So because the new Zelda game was going to take some time to develop, they decided to remake Wind Waker on Wii U to help hold over fans until the new game's release. Due to the fact that this new Zelda game would be rethinking every aspect of past Zelda titles, they didn't reveal any more info on the game during this Nintendo Direct. However, at E3 2014, we got our first look at the game, or at least a cinematic of the game, showing Link riding a horse while fighting a guardian, though some at the time speculated that the guy riding the horse wasn't really Link. After all, he's not wearing his signature green tunic, and plus, Aonuma had been quoted saying, "No one explicitly said that that was Link." That created quite a bit of speculation as to who this new character was, and whether he might have actually been a she. But that wasn't the case, as Aonuma later said that that was simply a joke, and that this person riding the horse was actually Link. It turns out though, as revealed in a much later interview, the team was actually considering having a female protagonist for a time, with the simplest option in their opinion as having Zelda herself as the main character. But in doing that, a new question arises: what would Link do? And plus, the team also had to consider what they called the balance of the Triforce. So taking into account both of these issues, they decided to just have Link as the main character once again. Going back to the video, as Aonuma explained, this new Zelda title was meant to bring Zelda back to its roots, like in the original Legend of Zelda for the NES, where you could explore all the world around you wherever you wanted. However, as time went on and the series switched to 3 dimensions, they just couldn't do that anymore. With Wind Waker, they tried to accomplish this by patching together small bunches of islands. However, you still had to enter and exit specific islands in order to explore. But now with the new Zelda game for Wii U, they could finally achieve in 3D what the original NES game already had: an open world, where puzzles start immediately when the player tries to decide where to go. No longer is there a set path, the player is now free to explore. At the end of the trailer, it states that the new Zelda game is set to release in 2015. However, as we know, that wasn't the case. But that release range was kept for almost a year, including in the next footage that we'll see. At the Game Awards 2014, the first gameplay video was shown with Miyamoto and Aonuma playing the new Zelda game together. The gameplay shows off some basic things, with Link exploring the world on foot, using a sailcloth, and riding a horse. One of the main things we learned about in this footage is that the horses actually have the ability to control their own movement, which leads Link to freely focus on attacking and aiming his bow, which has always been a difficult thing to do in past Zelda games. Plus, to make attacking even easier, you can now vault off your horse and shoot arrows in slow motion, much like in the E3 2014 teaser. Enemies also now have a life meter above their head after attacking them, much like in the Wind Waker when equipping that weird-looking hero's charm. When comparing this footage to the final game, we can notice quite a few changes that were made after this build was shown. First off, the HUD is very limited, missing many of the elements from the final version. However, it does almost resemble the final Pro HUD mode, which removes many of the on-screen elements like the minimap and the temperature meter. But even after that, the HUD is still different because of that magic meter. Now, I've looked through hours of footage of the game and haven't seen any magic meter, even when using what seems to be magic-based items like the fire rod. So it looks to have been cut, much like what happened with the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. And speaking of cut HUD elements, the entire gamepad functionality that was shown in the footage, with its map features and all that, have been completely removed from the game because Aonuma stated that it was disrupting the gameplay experience, which I can completely agree with. Later in the footage, during the horse riding sequence, there's some other HUD elements that were changed, removed, and added in. First, when choosing to get on the horse, the buttons that appear look slightly different. It's a black button with a white outline in the early version, but it's a white button with a black outline in the final. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the Japanese text next to it says Noru, which means to get on, or in this case, to mount. Once riding the horse, you should notice the controls on the bottom right were changed before the final version, because instead of a box with controls in it, the controls are lined up on the bottom of the screen. Looking at these controls, they look to be roughly the same, like Whoa is activated by pulling the left stick back, and Ya-ing is mapped to the A button. Except this version says Go instead of Ya. However, there's that R button too, which isn't used in the final. But after looking super close at that really blurry Japanese text beside the buttons, it turns out it reads Narameru, which means to soothe. So originally the soothe button was going to be mapped to the R button instead of the L button. Also, you should have already noticed that the Ya meter is missing from this build, and there's actually a reason for that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. For now, notice what happens when Link pulls out his bow on the horse. It shows an image of an arrow on the upper left corner with the amount on the top right of it. On the bottom left of the box, it shows a D-pad which looks like it would have been used to change the arrow type. In the final though, this entire arrow box isn't used at all. Instead, it'll show the number of arrows on the crosshairs, and you can change the arrows in the same kind of way that you change weapons. Some other various changes to the HUD include the heart meter's color, which changes between a dark and light red over time in the footage, though it stays the same color in the final. Not to mention there's no stamina meter in this build either, because when Link jumps off the cliff with a sailcloth, the meter doesn't appear as it does in the retail release. Now, speaking of Link jumping off the cliff, notice his sailcloth and compare it to the final game. Notice how it's completely different and more elaborate in the final versus the simple cloth design in this footage. Going back to the latter half of the footage, there's a couple of changes that I want you to note. First off, you can Ya as much as you want in this build, and by that I mean you can keep boosting the horse's speed without tiring it out. Likely this was done to allow Aonuma and Miyamoto to quickly move around the map in the footage, and was definitely going to be enabled in later builds. Now, how do I know for sure that it's unlimited? Well, if you listen in on the footage, you can hear Aonuma basically spamming the Ya button. And on an interesting note, Link saying Ya is different in this build compared to the final. Take a listen. One other thing that's sound related is the metallic sound that plays when you hit an enemy with an arrow. The way Aonuma puts it, the sound means that your arrow has hit the right spot and damaged your enemy. This was removed from the final game for good reasons, because as you'll hear now, it sounds very out of place.
Oh, I heard a metallic sound.
That sound tells you that your arrow has hit the right spot and damaged your enemy.
After showing the footage, Nintendo reaffirmed that the new Zelda game was indeed going to launch in 2015. But fast forward to March 27th, 2015. On that day, Nintendo shared a video with Aonuma regarding the new Zelda game's release date, which he explains has been pushed back indefinitely. The reason? Well, over the 3 months since the Game Awards, the development team had come up with several new ideas for the game, and working towards them had created even more new ideas too. So instead of focusing on that 2015 release, the team was now focusing on making the game as best it could be, to create the ultimate Zelda experience. But not only was this new Zelda game pushed back past 2015, but fans were also told not to expect the game at E3 that year. However, at the convention though, Reggie, the president of Nintendo of America, stated in an interview to expect the game to launch in 2016 instead. In March of 2015, Nintendo first announced their new dedicated gaming platform, the NX, later called the Nintendo Switch. This created a mountain of speculation, wondering if Nintendo was even going to release the new Zelda game on Wii U, or instead release it solely on the NX. At E3 2015 though, Miyamoto made sure to state that this new Zelda title was indeed going to release on the Wii U, but that is all he said on the matter. That is until November 2015's Nintendo Direct, which very briefly stated that the game was going to use the new Wolf Link amiibo in some way, and that the new Zelda title was going to, for sure, release in 2016. But that didn't happen either, because in March 2016, some financial documents from Nintendo stated that the new Zelda game for Wii U was actually going to release in 2017, which was later confirmed by Nintendo on Twitter, where it also stated that this new Zelda title was going to release for both the Wii U and NX simultaneously. The reason for this dual release is that 1, the game was taking longer than expected and they now actually had the chance to do it, and 2, since the game wasn't really taking much advantage of the Wii U's unique features, it wouldn't be as big of a deal to port over the game since it wouldn't have to be redesigned that much. At E3 2016, the curtain was finally lifted on this new Zelda game, or should I say, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, whose title was first announced during the Nintendo Treehouse presentation. But not only was the title finally revealed after roughly 5 years, but many people, including myself, got to play the game for the first time on Wii U, which was the only game that Nintendo brought to play at the convention. And while it may not have played the best at the time since the frame rate was really wonky, it showed what the game was capable of, and I can say firsthand that it was amazing. And since I got over 30 minutes of footage from the E3 2016 demo, we've got quite a bit of footage to compare to. But believe me, it's worth it, because there are tons of changes. First off, we played 2 demos at E3. The first was just us in a field allowing us to explore, and the second was roughly 20 minutes of the first part of the game's story. We'll start by looking at the first demo, but here's the thing. The demo put us somewhere in the world, and I couldn't exactly find where that was in the final game. Thusly, we can't really compare the topography of the first demo, so these first changes we'll look at are mostly differences in the UI. I'll also be showing you direct feed footage from Nintendo World Report TV for this first demo, as it's better quality than what I had taken at the time. Okay, right off the bat, you should notice a couple differences with the HUD. The time, instead of being over the weather forecaster, is on the minimap, with AM put in front of the time instead of before it. Plus, there's no weather forecaster in this demo, though you probably should have had it by then. Also, just so you know, if you notice that the D-pad icon in the upper left was replaced with 4 arrows, that's the difference between the Switch and Wii U versions, not an actual E3 change. Looking in the pouch reveals a few more differences in this build, though I guess I should technically call it the inventory, because that's what it eventually was called. First off, as you can see on the top of the screen, you can't move to the adventure log or system in the E3 build, and because of that, the 3 dots below the inventory icon were also removed. Actually, looking at the inventory, you'll notice that the cooking tab is missing. However, from the footage I took of the same E3 build, it's there. A very interesting discrepancy, which I can only assume is different because the direct feed footage was taken from a longer demo that was shown to select press, while mine was shown on the show floor. But anyway, you should notice that the Apple icon for materials was changed between both versions, and the icons in the E3 demo are smaller than what they eventually became. Oh, and also, the right stick's icon was changed slightly too. The materials themselves also have some changes as well, like how the health icon for food was moved from the bottom right to the top right between builds. And not only that, the Highland Shrooms icon was completely redone for the final version. Now, if those changes weren't interesting enough for you, get ready, because the story demo we play next changed a lot. I'm actually going to be using my personal footage of the second demo, as I couldn't find any better close-up, not shaky footage. Now, just a slight warning, this footage does contain the first 10 to 15 minutes of Breath of the Wild, and some might consider that a spoiler, even though Nintendo themselves have technically shown this part of the game numerous times in trailers, gameplay footage, etc. But if you want absolutely no info on the game's story, feel free to go to the time shown on the bottom of the screen and you'll be safe. But come back after you've played the game because there are so many differences here and I'd hate for you to miss out. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's get right to it, starting with the very beginning opening cutscene, which has an additional part right at the start, as well as different formatting of the text.
Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Wake up, Link.
Notice how at the end of the cutscene in the E3 demo, you're shown the location's title. However, this was removed from the final game. And also, once you get in control, you should notice that there's an additional plus button shown at the bottom to tell you how to view controls. That wasn't present in the E3 demo, or at least not shown. Everything is pretty much the same until you reach the second room. Here you'll find your clothes and, in the E3 demo, 2 additional barrels. Now Link, walk up to the pedestal and open up the door. That's when you'll find a very interesting difference with the light coming through this newly opened door. In the E3 demo, the light shines on the floor, but not in the final version. A very interesting change. Now that we're out in the wild, we get to view this amazing world, and lucky us, we see an old man in the distance. This, my friend, is where things start changing a lot. Just watch this exchange with the old man in both versions side by side. The changes are pretty obvious. Here, take a look.
Oh.
See what I mean? They basically changed almost every single line the old man says. Never before have I seen such a drastic change in a script between an E3 build and its final counterpart. But moving on, when Link is later alerted to open his Sheikah slate, what's shown on screen has a few differences too. First, the E3 demo has question marks below current location, as well as question marks next to the L button on top. While the marks underneath current location were removed, the ones on top were changed to a fictional language along with an added R button label. Also, take a look at the point to the left of the player. Notice how it's orangish in the E3 demo, but blue in the final. And speaking of points on the map, the one to the right has a couple of changes too. First off, instead of giving a descriptive name like the final version's followed the Sheikah slate, the E3 build simply says objective, once again with question marks below it. One thing I found interesting is that in the E3 demo, you aren't allowed to select the objective on the map as you can in the final game. Instead, you can only stamp it with these stamps. When the objective is set and ready to go, it appears on screen in both versions in big bold letters, but there's some differences between these builds. First, the E3 demo has an exclamation mark on the top left-hand corner, perhaps indicating that this is an urgent mission. However, the final game does something different. It says main quest on the top with the traditional Zelda logo, plus on the bottom it says new objective with the objective icon. Now once we follow the Sheikah slate and make it to the objective, we can use the tablet to raise towers throughout the land. And that's when we're hit with a big change. The tower's name is completely different. It's Great Plateau Tower in the final, but in the E3 demo it's called Resurrection Tower. After that we get the map information, which actually has an additional red X in my E3 footage, but it's not in any of the others I've seen, so I guess it's just me and I forgot I did something. Finally, we get to the last cutscene I could get footage of, but we've still got a lot of changes here too, so let's take a look at both versions side by side again.
Try to remember. You have been asleep for the past 100 years. The beast. When the beast regains its true power, this world will face its end. Now then, you must hurry, Link. Before it's too late.
Oh.
Months after the E3 demo was shown off to the public, a GameStop presentation slide included with their financial briefing stated that Breath of the Wild was going to release in Q1 2017, with some expecting that to mean that the game would release alongside the Switch. But just as that rumor started, more rumors began. In November, Emily Rogers went on record stating that due to localization issues and an expected 4 to 6 months of bug testing, there was just no way the team could get out the game in March. Instead, she expected the game to release in summer 2017 instead. Not only that, but both Eurogamer and Laura Kate Dale also expected a lack of Zelda at the Switch's launch, backing up Emily Rogers' claim. In fact, Laura Kate Dale even gave a more specific release date, with June 16th being the launch of the Switch version and June 23rd for Wii U. However, on January 13th, 2017, during the Nintendo Switch presentation, Nintendo confirmed, for sure this time, that Breath of the Wild would release as a launch title for the Switch. And even though many believed that the Wii U version was either delayed or cancelled, Nintendo also confirmed that the Wii U version would launch simultaneously with the Switch on March 3rd, 2017 as the last first-party Wii U game. And finally, it was finished. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild went gold on February 3rd, 2017. It took roughly 300 people and 4 years of focused work to make, but it finally happened, and it was worth it. Through many interviews with people who have close ties with the game, we've gotten to learn even more interesting facts about the development of Breath of the Wild. So why don't we go through some of these interviews now, shall we? First off, there's all those delays. What really happened? Well, in an interview with Kotaku, Miyamoto explained that, as with any Zelda game, while they want to get it out as soon as possible, the team always wants to make sure they make something new. And coming up with an estimated time based on something like that is extremely difficult. After all, at what point do you consider there's enough new? For Breath of the Wild specifically, it's obvious that there was a lot of new in this game. The AI, type of graphics, and physics engine were all a challenge for the team. However, the physics were labeled as the most challenging to implement by Miyamoto, due to the amount of tweaking required to strike a balance between realism and functionality, and the fact that the entire world is governed by the same engine, so even a little change could break anything, anywhere. Like how one time, a team member changed the world's wind strength for a puzzle they had created involving clay pots. However, this caused pots in another area of the map to all fly away. From then on, every member had to test the most current build of the game before moving on, just to make sure their changes weren't affecting another group negatively. Because of these issues, the team realized around mid-2014 that they were likely going to have to delay the game, but Miyamoto and Aonuma just couldn't accept that willingly. So Miyamoto decided to have someone else check out the game, and if they didn't find it able to be ready for the release window, they had to convince Aonuma to delay the game and then convince Miyamoto as well. And as we know, they didn't think it would be ready in time, and the game was delayed. Moving on, let's look at a time interview with Aonuma, and how Breath of the Wild's idea for a huge open world design started to take shape. It turns out that after deciding to make this new Zelda title an open world game, they saw that another team of younger developers were already working on creating a large world. They decided to bring them in and have older Zelda developers step aside a bit to introduce the new group. But a new issue emerged because of this. These younger developers didn't understand how earlier Zelda games were created and the conventions involved in creating them. There were times when the new team would ask Aonuma, "I know this has been done traditionally in other Zelda titles, but why does it have to be done this way?" And Aonuma found that he couldn't answer many of their questions. They were just traditions, and he didn't really know why they were there. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that many of these traditions didn't need to be around anymore in modern gaming. So he started destroying them one by one, as he put it. And this took quite a while to do. After all, as a result of removing the old, they had to create something new from the ground up. And that was the hardest part of Breath of the Wild's development. One of the conventions that was removed was Link's auto jump, something that's been around for years. Aonuma stated that the reason he kept it for so long was because no one ever questioned it. In the past, due to the lack of a jump button, the team had to design an environment so that players always knew where to go. However, in Breath of the Wild, there isn't just one or two places to go, and because of that, it would have been so much harder to keep the auto jump rather than just having Link jump manually. Plus, as Aonuma put it, walking up walls and having Link auto climb them wasn't very fun at all. But having Link jump onto the walls and then controlling the climbing was much more fun, and that's why the auto jump was removed. For a time, Aonuma wasn't 100% sure that this was the right change, but after E3 2016 and hearing everyone rave about the game, he was sure that he had made the right choice. Now there was another thing from this interview that caught my eye, the Guardians. You know, those octopus-like thingies. Well, the story behind them is very interesting, as they were actually the first enemy designed for Breath of the Wild, when it was created for the E3 2014 trailer. Turns out this enemy was based off of Octoroks from the first Legend of Zelda game for the NES. To Aonuma, while playing Zelda 1, he felt that these creatures were very large, so he thought, why not have a large octopus in Breath of the Wild? But a giant octopus in the game would be, as he said, kind of gross, so they chose to go for a sci-fi technology look instead. That design decision actually fundamentally changed many of the game elements as they kept developing Breath of the Wild. In Aonuma's own words, that trailer the Guardian was designed for became the basis for the whole game. In another interview, this time with IGN, Aonuma discussed the reason behind the name Breath of the Wild. Turns out he and Nate Bildorf from Nintendo Treehouse worked for many months to come up with a good subtitle for the new Zelda game. They spent a lot of time talking about plot points, items, and characters that would make a good subtitle. After all, many of the past Zelda games were based on things like this: Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, etc. But both of them kept coming back to the same thing in this new Zelda game: the world. Coming to the realization that this broken, melancholy world itself was the soul of the game, they decided to go for a subtitle that encompassed their view of the world. That name was The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Now, I don't typically talk about this on Beta64 episodes, but Breath of the Wild's system for testing, which we learned about thanks to an interview with GameCult, is actually very interesting. Apparently, the team had a tool that allowed them to track the movements of a ton of playtesters as they went through the game, and plotted all that information on a map. By doing so, they could see where the majority of people went, and more importantly, where they didn't go. Armed with that knowledge, they could then add in secrets in special areas where most people didn't go, in order to attract their attention. By doing this, they managed to create a world filled with many different secrets and areas for the player to discover and explore. In an interview with Eurogamer, Aonuma discussed details on Breath of the Wild's transition to the Switch. It turns out that the decision to release a Switch port wasn't firmly decided on until spring of 2016, which means that the port was roughly finished in 1 year, which is incredible for such a large game. One thing the team was very thankful about is how the Sheikah Slate in the game resembles both the Wii U gamepad and the Nintendo Switch. After all, the Sheikah Slate was originally designed after the Wii U gamepad, so the fact that they didn't have to change its appearance was a very lucky break. However, they did have to reduce the amount of elements involving the Sheikah Slate, since the game was no longer a Wii U exclusive. That included having the tablet talk to you and display information on the gamepad screen. But since these features already felt out of place at this point, they were going to be removed from the game anyway. Aonuma's interview with Game Informer gives us some interesting insight on the connection between Breath of the Wild and Zelda Skyward Sword. After Nintendo released the Wii title back in 2011, Zelda fans kept saying that they wished they could explore between the areas of the game, where they weren't able to go. In other words, they wanted a connected world. So the team decided that they wanted to create a world where the player could go anywhere they wanted, in order to search for places that they weren't necessarily supposed to go. Another idea that came from Skyward Sword was the stamina meter, which was a new addition that the team had enjoyed very much in Skyward Sword and wanted to expand on in the next game. The way they chose to do this in Breath of the Wild was with climbing. If you remember in Skyward Sword, you were only allowed to climb in specific areas, and the team decided that they were going to throw all those limitations out the window, allowing the player to climb anywhere they wanted to and explore anywhere they wanted to. And it all started with the desire to expand on Skyward Sword. The art style of Breath of the Wild was also discussed in the same interview. The reason the team chose the style they did was to differentiate the characters and backgrounds from each other, and provide a way to make specific parts of the environment distinct to the player, in order to show what the team wanted them to focus on. By having a realistic art style, this wouldn't have been possible, as the character and world would have blended together, so instead they went for a simpler style with basic colors, and wow, is it beautiful. Now, just so you know, this is where the video was actually supposed to end, but while I was editing this, Nintendo did a presentation at GDC 2017 talking about, guess what, the development of Breath of the Wild. At first I thought, nah, I don't need to add this info in, after all I've pretty much covered everything in this video, what else could there even be? And it turns out there used to be spaceships and rock and roll in this game. I'm not even joking. As crazy as it sounds, one of the early ideas for the game was to have a bunch of aliens show up and wreak havoc on the world of Zelda. Titles on the table for this game included Hyrule Wars from The Legend of Zelda and The Legend of Zelda Invasion. And if that wasn't crazy enough for you, how about the fact that they were considering having Link riding a motorcycle, playing an electric guitar, all while wearing a tracksuit? I couldn't make this stuff up even if I tried. What I found to be the most interesting thing in that presentation, though, is that Nintendo basically remastered the original Legend of Zelda for the NES to help test out ideas for Breath of the Wild. If they had an interesting idea that they wanted to test, they just put it in the 2D game to see how well it worked, which is a very smart way to go about this. Honestly, It looks incredible, and I really hope someday in the future they'll release it to the public, because I would absolutely love to play this game. So that's the development of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Despite having a long and challenging development full of unexpected twists, turns, and delays, I truly believe that the team has created something amazing. Something that has far exceeded anyone's expectations. And now the time has come for us to finally experience it for ourselves. It's been a long time coming, but I believe it was completely worth it to create this beautiful work of art. So this has been Beta64 with the development of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Thanks for watching.